Hello and welcome. The Russian Black Sea Fleet intercepted at least 2 Storm Shadow cruise missiles yesterday by putting their ships into the flight path. We will obviously talk about this, the implications for the Black Sea, and we will talk about the developments along the front line where we can document some more Ukrainian successes in this counteroffensive. We'll start with the developments along the northern front line here. I can document attacks from either side, from both sides, basically at several parts of the front line, down from the Serebryansk forest up to the region northeast of Kupiansk. What I cannot document, though, is any change in territory, so we'll skip this to save some time and to save you from hearing me mispronounce Ukrainian names a couple more times than necessary in this video. South of the Siversky Donetsk, there has been some Ukrainian success northeast of Bilohorivka. It seems like the Ukrainians were able to advance somewhat along the Seversky Donetsk in the direction here to the northeast. Probably no bigger importance than a tactical, but at least we can document some change in territory here. The Russians were attacking further south. They are attacking at Orikhovo-Vasilivka, probably along the ridge line here, trying to take back some of the positions they've lost in the past couple months. So far, they have not been successful in this. South of Bakhmut, the fighting is intensifying around Klishifka, Avdifka, and Kuryomivka. I can document some changes. First of all, we'll have this video here where we see Ukrainian troops in the center of Klishifka. Interesting too that there's still a flag of the Wagner group flying. And what you were able to see initially was this here. This is the church in the center of town. So we know the Ukrainians are here and they are holding it. They are having the area under well enough control that they can walk around taking the pictures and don't have to hush from cover to cover. We have the reports are now that the Russians have mostly abandoned Klishivka. According to whomever you listen to, it's either fully lost or fully occupied by the Ukrainians, or it's in it's part of the northeast on no man's lands as of now. We'll take the Ukrainian blogger Peterenko here, and he, for instance, shows us that in the northeast the area is now in the so-called gray zone, basically meaning neither side has permanent positions in this. So while Klishivka is probably, we cannot classify Klishivka as liberated yet, it seems like the Russian positions that the Russians are thrown out of there. By the way, at the same time, a few hours ago, Riba reported that the Russians did a counterattack and threw the Ukrainians completely out of Klishivka, and it's all part of the gray zone now because they were not able to occupy it because of Ukrainian artillery. This just to give you the full picture. As you've known from the past, I don't take Russian claims for successes serious, as I don't really take Ukrainian claims. We stick to what we can see in videos, in pictures, and what the opposite side has admitted as a defeat. So to me, this is likely propaganda, especially as they claim they threw them out completely, not just pushed them back, but they claim the Ukrainians completely lost the town while they themselves were not able to occupy it, which is obvious nonsense. So as of now, according to what I estimate, this map is more or less correct. The Russians likely do not have any additional positions inside of Klishivka, but the Ukrainians have not fully liberated it as of yet. Avdifka, further south, might have been, I declared it liberated in the last situation report because the Russians were saying they had lost it. It's probably no man's land right now, as they call it, the gray zone. There is no confirmation, not even from the Russian side, that they still have positions inside of Avdifka. But what we do not see is the Ukrainians having occupied it themselves, raised their flag, etc. So technically, it's probably not liberated yet, while the Russians are pushed over the railroad line here in Avdifka as well. They have withdrawn to that position as well. Further south, we have additional pressure being put on Kurdyumivka. The Ukrainians advance down here through the tree line towards Kurdyumivka on this side of the railroad. We have a geolocalization here that it's getting closer and closer to this where the Ukrainians already have taken positions. Wargonzo is saying that they had to withdraw over the railroad line. Wargonzo, pro-Russian mill blogger, said they had to withdraw over the railroad line here and basically had to give it up. And we have activity further south here as well in here at Mayorsk. We see that the Ukrainians are pushing through along the road here through the wooded area closer to the town of Mayorsk, which is down here. And if we see it, they basically, the Ukrainians are here now, which should show us that the so-called gray area, the no man's land, is pushed closer towards Mayorsk. Likely the Ukrainians were able to advance further in this direction as well. Further south at Avdifka, we have Russian counterattacks that were happening. In this area here, close to Kamyanka, they gained some ground recently. No, was it? Yeah. In this area, I think it was there. They gained some ground, tactical positions. They pushed the Ukrainians out of a few positions. Overall, no change in territory, but they were able to advance here, even though I have to admit right now, I'm not completely sure if it was at Vezele, but I think it was south of Kamyanka. Unfortunately, I don't have the map here right now. At the same time, the Ukrainians were advancing further south in the direction of Opitne. The Russians withdrew, and that's at least the reports even from pro-Russian military bloggers, that from drones they saw the Russians withdrawing and thought it was a massive Ukrainian attack south in the direction of the airport here. So the Russian artillery began shelling its own withdrawing troops, and the reports are at least 27 Russian soldiers are KIA due to their own artillery fire in this regard. But while this meant that some people were claiming Opitne is liberated, as of now it seems to be clear that Opitne still has Russian presence. There might have been a withdrawal, but the Ukrainians were not able to fully exploit this. The outermost areas of Opitne are probably contested, but I do not have any confirmation that the Ukrainians are actually in Opitne now, so that they hold positions. They have reached the outskirts, that much is for sure, and this is more or less 1 kilometer, even a little more than a kilometer advance in the direction of Opitne, but they have not taken the town, which is obviously important. If they manage to throw the Russians behind that river here, they will have a much easier position to defend, and at the same time the Ukrainian attacks are coming from Pervomaisk and Nevelske in the direction of Pisky, which is obviously meant to force a Russian withdrawal here from Volyane through a turning maneuver to basically secure the southern approaches to Avdifka and increase the pressure towards Donetsk city itself. Nevertheless, small Ukrainian successes here. Small Russian successes in this area that are smaller than the Ukrainian successes, but overall the situation hasn't changed massively here either. Wargonzo is reporting, again, the Russian military blogger is reporting of fresh counterattacks by the Russians with air support here at Opitne, but Wargonzo himself says that it has been unsuccessful, so the Russian counterattacks were failing. There's also a report of Russian attacks at Marinka and at Novomikhailivka. Here as well, the Russian attacks were failing. They didn't achieve anything. When we close in on the border between Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia in the area south of Velika Novosilka, we have the Ukrainians keeping up the pressure on Novomayorsk and Novodonetsk. As of now, I cannot document fresh successes. We know that the Ukrainians were able to cross the river here. We know that they entered the town, but it seems like they had to withdraw. I cannot confirm that they have a permanent position in here. And we had the Russians confirm that the Ukrainians were getting closer to Novodonetsk, that they were successful in this area, but I cannot confirm them having entered the town. So neither town is liberated as of now. Parts of Novomayorsk are likely contested, and it might be that the outskirts of Novodonetsk are contested, but as of now, the Russian positions are still holding, at least inside of the town. The Ukrainians were not able to throw them out. We have reports of Ukrainian attacks in Urushaine and Staromayorsk, where exactly I cannot document, but the reports are they were unsuccessful, and the Ukrainians were pushing towards Priyutne. They were also unsuccessful. There were Russian counterattacks on Staromayorsk as well as from Priyutne in the direction of Novodarivka. Again, unsuccessful, so no change in territory in this area either. Now we go to the focus of the Ukrainian offensive activities in the south as of now, the area south of Orikhiv. Here we had a Russian counterattack coming from the east, and they actually managed to gain not insignificant grounds. They advanced through the tree lines here. 2 or probably even 3 tree lines fell into the Russian hands. So they were pushing the Ukrainian positions here from the east, which will obviously divert Ukrainian attention, as they can't allow the Russians to start squeezing their advance to the south from the flanks. The Ukrainians claim they advanced 300 to 500 meters south and southeast of Robotine. According to reports, the outskirts of Novoprokopivka have been reached, and we can confirm this if we take my method, that we take a Russian admission as a confirmation. And according to this, according to Wargonzo here, the Ukrainian armed forces with support of artillery are trying to reach Novoprokopivka. Fierce fighting on the outskirts of a populated area, so they have reached the outskirts of Novoprokopivka. They are slowly advancing further south. So while we have some minor successes here, maybe some successes here, some not insignificant successes here, but still within limitations, some Russian success here, and further Ukrainian advances in this area, but still like slowly grinding forward, as well as finally northeast of Bilohorivka. Overall, the situation hasn't changed too dramatically. The big news is obviously coming from the Black Sea at this time. First, Ukrainian forces had liberated the gas platforms on the Black Sea. We see positions here, Crimea too. Those positions, those gas platforms, were lost to the Russians in 2014 or 2015. So they are right in front of the Crimean Peninsula in this area here. They were occupied by the Russians, and there are reports that the Ukrainians managed to capture radar systems here. So they were used for a military purpose by the Russians, and now the Ukrainians took them over. While there are some speculations how this can be used by the Ukrainians further, I don't think it's likely that they will put a serious permanent garrison on them. Maybe a handful of people, like 4 to 6 or something like this, to man a radar platform of themselves. But overall, the positions are far too vulnerable to missile strikes, and they are completely isolated, so that the Ukrainians will be able to put a garrison on there, and maybe even some platforms to fire missiles seems highly unlikely as of this point. One of the videos is actually showing a Russian Sukhoi 27 flying over the Ukrainian soldiers of the GUR, of the military intelligence special forces that had taken it. But this probably enabled a strike on the harbor of Sevastopol, as those positions were likely being used to surveil the area and the approaches to Sevastopol. Now, with Ukraine taking control over them and the listening posts, the radar positions on those platforms being lost, the Ukrainians were able to strike Sevastopol. There are documentations of various damages. Here, for instance, we see a Ropucha LST, a landing ship tank, that was hit. Parts of its masts have collapsed, and we see serious fire damage, and that should be the bridge, I think, the tower of a Kilo class, improved Kilo class submarine. Both of them were in dry dock, and we have confirmation that they have been hit. This is the ship that was hit here. The ship is very likely at least a financially a complete loss. Obviously, you can repair everything if you pump enough money into it, but with this extensive fire damage, it seems extremely unlikely that this is recoverable. We see here, for instance, images of the fire in the background of the ship that had been hit here, and the damage here is also, we see the fires all over the ship. This is not going to be easy for the Russians to turn this into something useful again. But as said, like taking the look here, it seems extremely likely that this is the improved Kilo-class submarine that was in the dry dock as well. We see it here on the picture of the from the satellite here. The Russians were using this to probably do maintenance on both ships. The Kilo class is used in the Crimean in the Black Sea by the Russians to fire caliber on Ukrainian targets, and the landing ship was used to threaten Odessa with naval invasion initially. There are some reports that supposedly not only were 2 ships destroyed, but 2 others damaged, and there were, like, the confusion led to firefights among Russian units that led to casualties, even KIA in this scenario. I don't see any confirmation whatsoever. It might be true, but as of now, we don't have proof, so we don't take it serious as of now. The interesting part is, though, that when we look at the images here, we see the massive damage, especially in comparison to the past, to the pictures from the day before. We see the extensive scorching, showing the fire damage, and obviously the whole structure of the boats will be massively compromised by extensive fire. So both ships should be a complete loss. The Russians might be able to repair them but financially it's probably better to just write them off and make a new one. The interesting part is, though, that while those ships were damaged in this, they were in the dry dock at the same time. And fire that destroys ships should do some damage to the dry dock as well. And this is especially important as the dry dock capacity of the Russians is very limited in the Black Sea. Initially, they planned to build dry docks in Novorossiya when it was likely that they would lose their naval base in Sevastopol. But with the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, the Russians didn't feel any additional need. They still have floating docks there. They still have more docking capacity, but at the same time, the more they lose, the more it will put the strain on the existing capacity, and the less maintenance will be able to be performed, the less repairs will be possible on those ships that are in the docks and in the Black Sea. So overall, the usability of the ships of the Black Sea should diminish. Right now, there were some claims that it was Neptunes, so the anti-ship missiles that Ukraine supposedly modified for ground attack as well. But both Western media, as we have here, for instance, both Western media as well as as Riba are writing that it was Storm Shadow. Riba, for instance, was mentioning 10 Storm Shadows were fired. 7 of them were intercepted, which would be interesting because the Sukhoi 24M that the Ukrainians use can carry 2. So we know that at the same time, at the very least, Ukraine still has 5 operational Storm Shadows. This gives us an indication. They started with at least 12 and they should have refurbished a couple of others. But now we know that at the very least, they still have 5 fully operational at the same time for a strike like this. The interesting part is, though, that we have a report here from 2 days ago, that the British were accusing the Russians of striking a grain freighter in Odessa, a freight ship, a civilian freighter. There are still discussions how often Storm Shadows have been used on the Crimean Peninsula. I just saw a report from Sky News, I think it was, and they said this is the first time Storm Shadows has been used. The Russians were claiming it before that they have been used. We do know that Storm Shadows were used on the bridges into the Crimea, but all the strikes on the Crimea itself were unconfirmed if it was Storm Shadow. So it seems to be that the British and probably the French limited the use to everything outside of Crimea, but it's fairly obvious that there might be a connection between the Russians, the British making accusations towards the Russians that they struck civilian ships and basically giving the Ukrainians a permission to strike back at the Black Sea's fleet in return. Now, the implications of this are somewhat mixed. The Russians still have several other Kilo class left, so they will be able to keep firing. They will be able to keep firing caliber towards the Ukrainians. Obviously, this caliber, this Kilo class, improved Kilo class boat was in the dry dock, so it wasn't even in operational service as of now in full use. But it will diminish the possibilities of the Russians. It would diminish their capabilities. Overall, it's obviously a weakening of the Black Sea's fleet, even though it might not be devastating yet. The implications might be worse when it comes to in regards to the damage done to the dry docks here, as the strike has only struck 2 ships, but a damage to the dry dock basically strikes the whole fleet, as the whole fleet will have higher trouble to get maintenance and thus stay operational. The LST itself is unusable by now with the with the Ukrainian anti-ship missiles along the shore, so that the LST would have been used on a naval invasion close to Odessa is basically out of the question as of now, but it could have been of massive use if the Ukrainians reach the Crimean Peninsula or at least cut off the land bridge here. Once this is done, the Russians will get increasing supply problems, and they're an LST which is able to carry heavy weaponry, which is able to basically have take trucks with full load on board and unload them even on the beach, so outside of a harbor. Their ships like this would be of massive importance as they lessen the strain on the harbors, as they lessen the strain on air transport, while being able to supply the Crimean Peninsula. So taking this ship out might not have an immediate effect, but if the Ukrainians reach the Azov Sea, then it will be felt that this ship is taken out of commission, very likely permanently. This seems to be unrepairable by any rational means. Like I said, you can basically repair every piece of scrap, but financially this should be a complete loss. Overall, another interesting factor is that this is being reported that at the same time, while the strike on Crimea happened, where according to Riba, naval drones were also used, Starlink had an outage. Now, I have no idea if this graphics is correct. I have no idea whether that was worldwide or just in the US, because we have United States here. I have no idea if this was just in Eastern Europe. As said, unfortunately I can't say much, but it would probably be wrong to keep this completely out of the situation report if there are reports about this, and while Elon Musk is saying that he declined the usage of Starlink against the Crimean Peninsula, against Sevastopol, and compared it with a potential Pearl Harbor, which obviously makes no sense in itself whatsoever in historic context, etc. But it seems, at least the accusation is that Starlink again turned off the connectivity while the attack was happening. Whether that's true or not, unfortunately, I'm not able to confirm you. But what we can say is there are some obvious connections. The strike happened after the platforms were taken. They were likely used for the Russians to surveil the western part of the Black Sea, both against naval drones, which should make attacks easier in the future, as well as against airstrikes. The Storm Shadow have a limited range, so they were probably fired somewhat along this area. If the Russians are missing elevated radar platforms, and we see here somewhere, where was it here? This isn't a small position. This is like 30-40 meters or even higher above the sea, above the surface, and thus gives a fairly big range for a radar across the for low-flying targets. All of this is a loss for the Russians, and this might have actually enabled the strike, as it made approaching the launch distance much easier and much safer for the Ukrainians. So this all seems to be connected, and whether this was the decision for the British to allow the strike is obviously pure speculation, but we see the connection here regardless. Interesting though, we have further information in other regards that are also getting spicy. This is Cheka OGPU. This is a Telegram channel that is considered to be well connected within the Russian intelligence agencies. They have brought us a ton of internal documents that we were not able to verify, but later basically had proven to be true, at least in what has happened afterwards. And according to them, the Russians are considering the next wave of mobilization. It's supposed to be 170 to 175,000 strong. Russia wants to make up for, in total, they need 300,000, and they plan to make up the rest of the 130,000 by coercion, to coerce soldiers and civilians to sign up as contract soldiers. This will, in connection of this, they will likely move back the fall conscription from 1st of October to 1st of November, like last year when they did the mobilization. But as they say right now, there's still a discussion between the Siloviki in the presidential administration and security officers that are like hawks. The presidential administration personnel is worried about the stability of Russia, both threats from above as well as threats from below, while the security officers want to go all in and basically force a situation where Russia is sure to win in the near future. So as of now, we don't see this to happen now. They don't even claim that it's going to happen, but it seems increasingly likely. And we talked about this here in the past, that from a military standpoint, the next wave of mobilization should have happened in December or January, like basically 9 months ago, not now. So Russia probably really needs the personnel. So it's the weighing of options, whether you take the risk internally by putting more stress of the war on your population, or if you risk military disadvantage by not having enough manpower. Also, Kim Jong-un has reached Russia with his armored train, and he's going to meet Putin. Likely, it's going to be the talk is going to be about selling ammunition. I tried to find out how much North Korea might have on stock, how high their production capacities are, and I didn't find anything remotely close to being able to be quoted. The reason for that is that obviously North Korea is a blocked off country, but we should expect it to have millions upon millions. My guesstimate would be at least in the not at least, but solidly in the 2 digits of millions. So they should have 10, 20, maybe 30 million rounds. The reason for that is that North Korea, especially under Kim Il-sung, I think was it? No, under Kim Jong-il, with the Chuche doctrine, where military came first, the likelihood of the ammunition factories being shut down in favor of anything else seems very unlikely. And North Korea has such a strong artillery force that it's one of its deterrences against South Korea, that they can basically wipe out Seoul, the capital of South Korea, within 24 hours with their massive artillery barrages. So it seems likely that they have tens of millions of artillery shells and significant production capacities that kept pumping it out. But that's purely my guesstimate. I have no solid data whatsoever for this. I just connect the dots here, and that's what conclusion I can come to. It might be completely wrong, but at least in regards to the amount of artillery they have, it seems like North Korea is even more relying on artillery, even in comparison with Russia. So their artillery storages should be much bigger. We have some data, though, about their artillery shells. You might remember that a couple of years ago, North Korean artillery shelled a South Korean island along the ceasefire line. And the data I found was that 50% of the shells weren't even hitting the islands. And of those that were hitting the island, 20% were dots, which would indicate bad quality of the shells, and both in accuracy as well as in reliability. So at least in the estimates, we would guess that the artillery shells that Russia might gain out of this will likely not be very useful. They will more likely being good for basically carpeting an area, not for precision strikes, as the shells seem to be unreliable. And and due to lax production standards, probably very inaccurate. And the next thing would be, it would be likely at least that North Korea would hand over older shells, not fresh production ones, but that obviously could be up for negotiations. But it will help Russia, no doubt, if it comes to bigger sales of artillery shells. But I've read some analysis and most agree that, yeah, it's good for Russia, but it's not going to be decisive. So we'll have to keep an eye on it. Unfortunately, I can't say more, but from everything I found, those shells will only be good for carpet bombing, not for precision strikes, which should be an advantage, especially while the Ukrainians have effective counter-battery fire and thus can take out the artillery, the tubes faster than the Russians can in return. We have something from the political sphere as well. A pro-Russian Ukrainian mill blogger, Gennady Dubovoy, has been killed in Donetsk. He has been run over by a car. Lately, he's been critical with the Russian military and its treatment of veterans and Wagner soldiers. Obviously, there are no speculations that he might have been killed to silence a critical voice. But then I checked his Telegram channel and we see it has 5,500 followers. So that the Russian GRU kills this military blogger for saying something mean seems fairly unlikely. If he was actually killed, if he was murdered, it's probably more likely that the Ukrainians did it, the GUR or the SBU. They have done targeted killings of traitors in the past, and for the Ukrainians, he is a traitor as he was a Ukrainian citizen who switched sides to the Russians, but it might have been an accident as well, so not much to say there. International support, Germany Rheinmetall has received the order for additional 40 Marder IFVs. They are former Bundeswehr, and Rheinmetall will now completely refurbish them and hand them over to the Ukrainians. Switzerland has now finally signed off on the sale of 25 Leopard 2A4s to Rheinmetall as well. Here it's important, as while Switzerland does not allow them to be given to Ukraine, they will replace tanks that are given to Ukraine from other nations. So in net, while those specific tanks might not come to Ukraine, this should mean an additional 25 tanks for Ukraine regardless. And the reports here are that in the Warzone from the drive, that Sweden is considering to hand over Gripens. This is important as the Gripen is basically designed for a war that Ukraine is fighting against Russia. While Russia is threatening every position, it's meant to be receive maintenance from conscripts, not from specialists that have been trained for years on end. It's meant to receive maintenance on some side road in the woods, not in a climatized hangar. And the important thing is it can use the Meteor AAM. This is probably the most modern Western long-distance AAM anti-air missile, air-to-air missile that is currently in usage. It has a range of at least 200 kilometers and would be an immense help for the Ukrainians, as they are also fire and forget. Like, it's a fully active radar homing missile that the Ukrainians can fire and then immediately turn back, which would more or less equalize the issue where the Russians are now threatening the Ukrainian planes with Rs-37M, which is also long distance and also active radar homing. It has a little more range, probably the R-37M, but in this regard, at least the Ukrainians could catch up to a certain degree and threaten the Russian fighter, the Russian tactical fleet a lot more than they could have done before. Then we have a small video which is highly interesting. This is showing us a BMP-1TS that is given to, or basically three of them that are given to that are in service with a Ukrainian unit. This would be an indication that the Ukrainians might have restarted production of them, and this is massive because Ukraine has received a lot of BMP-1s and they had a lot of them. They probably had even more on some rusty old depot yards at the same time, but the BMP-1 is completely obsolete. It has a low pressure 73 millimeter gun that is more or less like good enough for firing a high explosives at maximum a kilometer. So any modern threat they are more or less useless against. But what we see here is that the 1TS version is receiving an autocannon, a 30 millimeter autocannon, and modern ATGMs. So with one stroke, with one modernization, this turns the completely obsolete BMP-1 basically into a modernized BMP-2, or at least to a certain degree, and makes its combat efficiency much, much higher. If the Ukrainians are able to do this modernization to a significant part of their BMP-1s, it would increase the combat capabilities of their BMP-1 fleet drastically. This cannot be understated how much of an improvement it is in comparison to the regular BMP-1. And finally, we have something that was to be expected after we have seen tires on top of planes. Now the Russians built cages for their planes as well, and while there can be a lot of mockery about this, it actually makes a lot of sense. If supposedly the strike on the Ilyushin 76 was done by quadcopters, by small drones that were flying in, and if we're not talking about a cruise missile, which will obviously just punch through that, but when we're talking about small drones with very light warheads, small weight, then basically making a cage around a plane seems to be a fairly efficient and fast way to secure them against such attacks, and this is being done here now. This was it for now for this situation report. If you like this situation report, then please hit the thumbs up. Leave a comment for the algorithm, what you think about the current development, and what do you think about the Black Sea Fleet disaster that has happened. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.